Well, g'day everybody, and welcome to this edition of IPhoneConservative. Last month marked the 10th anniversary of the Iraq War. The mainstream media, predictably, took the opportunity to once again trot out the same tired old progressive memes that now pass for critical analysis by those on the left. Now, it's not my primary purpose today to defend the decision to go into Iraq and topple Saddam Hussein. Rather, I'd like to examine the failure of logic, the cognitive dysfunction that lies at the centre of the left's narrative of the war in Iraq. Now, to do so, we'll have to look at the three most widely disseminated criticisms of the war in general and the Bush administration in particular. The left's three main criticisms are: 1. WMDs, 2. what the left like to term blood for oil, and 3. the al-Qaeda connection. These are the primary platforms of the left's Iraq War narrative, and these ideas have become central to countering any attempt to defend our involvement in Iraq. Because of this, it's important that this 10-year anniversary we look critically at the substance and the structure of these criticisms. So let's have a look at the left's criticism of the weapons of mass destruction argument. This is probably the most often used opposition to the Iraq War, but as I stated earlier, it's based on a fundamental logical flaw. To illustrate this flaw, I'll have to draw in fairly broad strokes the outline of the left's criticism of the Bush administration's case for WMD and the left's antagonism for the figure of George Bush himself. The left's argument goes something like this: George Bush used the threat of WMDs as a pretext in order to justify an invasion of Iraq. His motivations were base and dishonest, and greed and a lust for power at the heart of his actions. The Bush administration lied and fabricated evidence to mislead not only the American people, but the United Nations and by extension the people of the world. Now, this is generally known by the soundbite-loving left as the Bush lied, people died argument. Now, to deconstruct this narrative, and that's what it is, a narrative, it's important to note the massive protests in the first weeks of the invasion, with thousands of protesters carried placards and banners that proclaimed Bush is Hitler and Bush is a corporate warmonger. Because the left's criticism of the case of WMDs is largely based on what the left believed Bush was capable of. The left bolster their argument by saying that the decision made by the administration were largely influenced by the character of George W. Bush. And this is a fundamentally important point to keep in mind as we move on. Now, Bush, failing to get a UN mandate for the invasion, acted unilaterally and invaded Iraq in March 2003. So what happened? Well, no weapons of mass destruction were found. And what conclusion can we draw from that? Well, this totally vindicates George Bush. Confused? Alright, let me explain. If we follow the logic of the anti-Iraq war narrative that the Bush administration knowingly deceived the world on WMDs, we would have found WMDs. The left can't have it both ways. They can't maintain that he's an evil warmonger who will lie and manufacture evidence, but also accept that he's somehow too scrupulous to plant the evidence that would have justified the invasion. The left readily assert that the US military and the intelligence services have the ability, through the black ops or CIA false flag operatives, to plant evidence and to make sure that it's discovered. It's a common libel on the left, and one only has to look at the thousands of 9/11 conspiracy sites to confirm that. No, logic shows that the very politically damaging inability to uncover WMDs in the months following the invasion was due to the fact that the Bush administration were convinced that they would find them. Clearly then, the case for the existence of weapons of mass destruction was based not upon an attempt to knowingly mislead the American public, but rather upon flawed intelligence and analysis. And that, my friends, is a horse of an entirely different colour. Now, let's have a look at the blood for oil narrative. The common perceived wisdom, at least by those on the left, is, of course we steal people's oil, that's what America does. Iraq, the left would contend, was just a more blatantly egregious example of the same. So let's have a look and see if the Iraq War really was all about oil. Now the left would have you believe that it was Iraq's vast, undeveloped oil reserves that were the primary reason that we went to war. As evidence for this assertion, they point to the fact that both Bush and Cheney were oilmen or had dealings with the major oil corporations. The inference being that both men were indebted or on the payroll of big oil. And big oil, as most members of the Democrat Party will tell you, is a rapacious, self-interested affiliation that puts profits before people. So, if it's true that the interests of big oil were the primary motivator for our decision to oust Saddam, then why did the Democrat Party, a group traditionally antipathetic to big oil, vote overwhelmingly in both the House and the Senate for the 2002 resolutions to go into Iraq? Obviously the decision to oust Saddam, at least in the minds of the honourable members of the Democrat Party, must have been based on something other than the share market price of oil producing companies. Now of course, Iraq oil reserves had some bearing on the planning and decision-making process. To believe otherwise is to deny the strategic importance of oil to any developed nation. All developed nations, all governments of developed nations, spend considerable time and resources in developing policies to ensure energy security. But the accusation made by the left is that it was our desire to seize, to effectively steal Iraq's oil reserves that was the major determining factor. Well, there's an easy way to disprove this allegation. By resorting to the use of measurable, verifiable data, the things that we used to call facts, we can determine if the blood for oil argument is true. If America's military intervention in Iraq was based on stealing the oil of Iraq, then just how successful were we? Well, have a look at this chart detailing America's use of Iraqi oil. Well, as you can see, the chart shows what Al Gore, another oil man by the way, would call an inconvenient truth. America, its importation of Iraq oil, has been in steady decline since its high point in 2001, 2 years before the Iraq War. And in fact, as this chart shows, oil has never provided more than 4% of America's imported oil. Whilst it is true that America had an interest in Iraq's oil potential, if for no other reason than it gave Saddam the financial resources for the funding of various terrorist organisations, America itself was in no way reliant upon Iraqi oil for its strategic or economic security. Finally, if it was true that America went to war for oil, it'd be reasonable to assume that America would maintain a stranglehold on supply and production. So, 10 years on, who's the main beneficiary of Iraqi oil? Well, you may be surprised to learn that it's not America, but China, which has increased its trade with Iraq from 17 million to 17.5 billion. That is unarguably the major beneficiary of a post-Saddam Iraq. And it was China, not America, that was granted the first post-war oil license for the al-Qaeda oil fields. So much for the oil bonanza posited by the conspiracy theorists on the left. Finally, let's look at the Saddam-al-Qaeda connection. Those that attack the Bush administration for misleading the American public on the presence of al-Qaeda in Iraq base their argument on this statement made by Vice President Dick Cheney in 2002.
Public out there, the Czechs alleged that Mohammed Atta, the lead attacker, met in Prague with a senior Iraqi intelligence official 5 months before the attack, but we've never been able to develop any more of that yet.
Now, the Mohammed Atta connection has never been conclusively verified, and this has been used by the left as proof that the administration lied in order to bolster their argument about the need to go to war. But does the failure to connect Atta with the Iraqi regime prove that al-Qaeda itself was not associated with Saddam? Well, in March 2008, the Pentagon released a document titled The Iraqi Perspectives Project, Saddam and Terrorism, which details many of the original classified documents captured after the fall of the Saddam regime. Now, to understand the importance of these documents, we have to understand what al-Qaeda is and what it isn't. Al-Qaeda is first and foremost an idea, an ideological brand. It's not a top-down hierarchical organisation, but rather a loose confederation of groups with various common aims and objectives. Now, these are the 9 major al-Qaeda affiliates that are identified by the Council on Foreign Relations. For the purposes of this analysis, the group we are primarily concerned with is Egyptian Islamic Jihad, or the EIJ. And what is the EIJ? Well, this is the group that assassinated Egyptian President Anwar Sadat in 1981, and later teamed up with Osama bin Laden in the Afghan war against the Soviet occupation. Now, on page 16, extract 12 of the Pentagon Papers, there's a memorandum that was drafted in Saddam's presidential office, which specifically shows that Saddam was directly funding and training the EIJ. And who was the leader of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad? Why, none other than this man, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the man who was widely regarded as Osama bin Laden's chief deputy, and the person who masterminded the attacks on 9/11. Al-Zawahiri was the leader of EIJ prior to its 1998 merging with al-Qaeda. Now, is it reasonable to assume that the man who founded the EIJ, who was involved in it for over 10 years, would break all contact with it when he joined up with Osama bin Laden? I don't think so. The EIJ was an al-Qaeda affiliate, and Saddam was directly funding the EIJ. Now, this fact has been consistently subverted or omitted by the mainstream media, who are seemingly more concerned with excoriating Bush than the reporting of facts. Now, there are many legitimate criticisms that can be made against the Iraq War and the way it was conducted. But the value of critical analysis is based on the lessons that it teaches us, on the tools honest criticism gives us to learn from our mistakes. The cost to our treasuries is too great. The lives of our soldiers, our fellow citizens, too precious to allow the lessons that we must learn to be determined by memes and narratives that have no basis in fact. The servicemen and women who gave their lives in Operation Iraqi Freedom, the innocent Iraqi men, women and children who were killed by those opposing it, they deserve better. They deserve the truth.